Hello everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon for this Think Further webinar all around research engagement. My name's Michaela, I'm the Public Engagement Facilitator here at the University of Oxford, and it's my job to help researchers carry out public engagement with research. I'm really pleased today to be joined by three wonderful researchers who have a breadth of experience doing wider engagement around their research. So we'll be hearing from Professor Angela Russell, Dr. Tom Hart, and Professor David Pyle. They're going to be talking about a range of things that they've done from public engagement, business engagement, and policy engagement. So they'll talk about their experiences one by one, and of course we'll try and include the questions that have been asked in advance. Very quickly before we get started, we know there are lots of really good reasons to engage widely with your research. We'll hear about some of the motivations and reasons, I'm sure, but at the end I'll provide some further resources if you want to delve into and explore why engagement matters a little bit more in more depth. Right, so without any further ado, we'll go into it. So first of all, we're going to hear from Professor Angela Russell, who is a medicinal chemist here at the University of Oxford. You straddle pathology and chemistry? Pharmacology, sorry.
That's living, not dead.
Living, oh, of course, living, not dead. So Angela's work is around drug discovery and looking at drug mechanisms. You've worked on a range of things, cancer, Duchenne's, and also stimulating stem cells for regenerative medicine, which sounds super cool. But you've also spun out a couple of businesses from research. So yeah, hand over to you to sort of talk about your experiences.
Thank you, Michaela. Okay, so I have been a professor at the university, run my independent group for the last 12 years, and I've been involved in spinning out companies now for 15 years. So I thought what would probably be helpful is I told you a little about my inspiration and how I got into this in the first place. So I'd been involved in a project which is now going back 17 years, where I'd been trying to work with a group at the university, Professor Dame K. Davies, to discover a small molecule drug that could increase levels of a protein that could compensate in a rare neuromuscular disease that we were interested in, called Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which you mentioned. And for us, it was a pretty radical idea in medicine at that time that you would be able to do this. And so we really wanted it, we believed in the concept, but it was very difficult to get funding through conventional routes. So one of the major motivations behind setting up the first spin-out company that I was involved in, which was called Vastox at the time, it's now called Summit Therapeutics, was to provide a vehicle in which we could raise the money, prove principle, and then actually drive that compound on into the clinic, which is what we were able to do. So that was the scientific motivation, and the motivation to try and actually make a difference and take this forward into patients. But for me, I don't think it would ever have happened. I would never have been involved in it if it hadn't been for the influence of someone like Kay, who's been a mentor to me largely throughout my career, and also Steve Davies, who was my academic supervisor at the time in chemistry, who also had an unbelievable track record in entrepreneurship. He spun out more than 15 companies, I think, in his career. So that was a very strong positive influence on me to really believe, give me the confidence that, you know, this was a good idea to do and to take part in it. And that's been an influence throughout my career. So I wasn't actually a founder of Vastox as was, but I was a consultant to that company, and in one way or another I've remained involved in that throughout the time, throughout the development of that that project rather. And that's been an incredibly valuable experience to me, to see how something is taken from concept through an in vivo proof of concept through into the clinic. And that has been taken throughout my whole career. There was a question about balance and timing. And as I've got more and more involved in these things, and I should say that the work that we did with Summit, which became part of Summit, then inspired us, as you've mentioned already, to think about how we might make this concept more broadly applicable. And could we think about developing medicines that actually would stimulate regeneration in a whole host of diseases, not just a neuromuscular disease. And that, again, an even more crazy idea, and on a bigger scale, perhaps, than Vastox was originally conceived. So that was one of the things. That was the first company that I was, really involved on a big scale in spinning out. The other thing that's important, and where it comes into the balance with what goes on in my academic life, is because we had to work out a way in how I could drive the research and be part of what's going on, but at the same time maintain an interest in actually how we translate this. So the solution that we came up with was actually we'd spin out the company, we'd raise the funds which go into the company, but actually what that did was to trigger research contracts within the university. So we raised nearly £17 million, and of that, more than 13.5 million has come straight back into the university to come into to fund work that I do in my lab, but also in collaboration with our partners across medical sciences. And I think many others have done similar models now, I've seen, and I think this is a really attractive way. It comes with certain burdens in terms of how you manage conflicts, in terms of the way that research is conducted in your lab and the transparency that you need to have. But it's been incredibly effective in actually driving the research forward, being able to capitalise on the university infrastructure, have my input heavily into these early stage discovery aspects of the project, and then see it through to translation into the company.
No, that's good. We've got a few minutes left. So I guess I'd ask, in terms of the process and how it worked, obviously at Oxford we have Oxford University Innovation, which helps with sort of commercialization and getting licenses and all of that sorted out. So in terms of your involvement with the nuts and bolts, was it the sort of thing that you found support through them in sort of the process? Like if someone out there is thinking like, well, how do I do this? That sounds like a great idea. Like, what would you suggest?
So there are different elements for what needs to be done in order to spin out of the company, a company from a university setting. In our case, it was complicated because we, at the same time as spinning out a company, were trying to negotiate research contracts to come back in. Mm-hmm. So actually, I could not have been involved and should not have been involved in any aspect of that negotiation because it's clearly a conflict for me. How am I going to say I need this amount of money and then ask my company to give me that amount of money, for instance, and the terms in which the contract should be set up? That's a more unusual circumstance. What I was directly involved in, which is the other important element, is raising the money in the first place. So for me, there was a lot of time out on the road talking to investors, making sure we talked to the right type of investor, someone that was really could understand our model, could understand our vision, and was prepared to come and put money in. And this is going to be a long return, right? Drug discovery doesn't happen in 2 or 3 years. It happens over the course of 10 to 15 years. And people that are going to fund it have to obviously understand that. So that was a very eye-opening experience for me. And that was really how I got into the nuts and bolts, as you put it, of because to go out and effectively pitch, you have to have a very clear vision for what you're going to achieve. You have to have a very clear idea of what you're going to need in order to succeed, why you can do it and no one else in the world can do it, and how you're actually going to effectively execute it. So all of that aspect I was involved in. I think if it hadn't been such a complex arrangement, I'm sure I would have been involved in research services and university and technology transfer office, but I couldn't be.
No. So it sounds like being able to have mentors and role models, and also getting your pitch honed are kind of some of the key things if you're very sort of embryonic in your journey and thinking about this.
Absolutely right. So that's what I always encourage in anyone that's thinking about doing this. If they have a good idea, that's exactly the sort of thing that they need to do. And pitching is a lot about confidence as well, right? And that's something that I had to learn very quickly. It's of course you have to be able to back it up, but actually to be able to walk through the door and be able to very confidently articulate what you're trying to do gets you a long way down the road. And the only way really, some people confidence comes naturally. Some people it requires some practice, right? And so practicing your pitch, getting honest feedback is absolutely critical. And I think it's something that there are support mechanisms in the university. It's something that we could probably do more of, not just in Oxford, but I'd say nationwide.
Where do you think was the key bit of support for you? Was it that mentor, or was there a bit of training or something?
So for me, it was the mentorship. I think this is a question that's often asked: what would I have differently, or what would I like to be different now? And I think if there had been more of the support that's available now, available to me, say 5 years ago, that would have actually helped a lot. I had to learn an awful lot of things for myself. Getting the pitch wrong, not being properly prepared when you go in, and things like this. Those are hard lessons, because you only get one shot at this a lot of the time with a particular investor. So I think that would be good, and I would encourage people to seek out that sort of support, because it is a lot more widely available now. The other thing I think is to think, which again I had to learn, is to think really hard about the long-term vision for any business. Okay, I think we're far too good at thinking of a good idea and then thinking of a way that we could sell it in 3 years, let's say, and that can be a good model for business. But actually, the really innovative ideas and the really groundbreaking transformations that we're going to make are things that are going to take that bit longer. And I think more support to encourage people to think, be brave and go long term, have long term views for how they're going to really build businesses in the UK is really important.
Yeah. And you said you had a lot of lessons to learn along the way. And I think of usually kind of being able to deal with failure as a key skill for those who want to be entrepreneurial, whatever. Like, did you have very many failures along the way? Or?
Yes, of course. Yeah, lots of rejections and miscommunication.
Yeah.
The biggest single failure I would say that we faced along the way was with that first company that I talked about. We took our first compound into the clinic. It looked really promising halfway through a key pivotal trial, but at the end it failed to meet its endpoints. And that was devastating, really devastating, both from the perspective, a personal perspective, from the perspective of the company, but really most importantly, it was emotionally devastating because you could see the disappointment from the patient group dealing with a small disease where actually families and patients are involved in this. And understandably, the company had to make a decision whether they wanted to pursue the area or not. They're a biotech company. They're relatively small, and they couldn't continue it. Right. That doesn't mean, and we have continued to work on it from an academic setting and setting up a new partnership. But that was tough, and it was tough to then try and understand, why didn't it work? And I think those are the critical questions you have to ask. What would we do differently next time? And I think with many of these things, there are things that we could not have foreseen. And that's very challenging because it may be that the same mistakes are made again. But there were an awful lot of things that we did learn about that and that we would apply in the future to try and ensure things are more successful, certainly faster. Let's put it that way.
Great. And I suppose just to end on a slightly positive note is just, you said you did find it as a highly valuable thing to do. It helped get money in to support research and things like that. But overall, do you feel like it's been a very good thing for you to do?
Absolutely. I would not go back and do what I have done in terms of spinning out companies any differently. So it's been hugely valuable, I think, for me personally to drive forward the area of research. So if you take the later company that I span out, that was really the first company of its kind to do regenerative medicine on that scale. And now we find there's lots of companies popping up all over the world, and suddenly there's a real momentum in the area. So I think it's inspiring to see that. It's inspiring to see in people that have come into my research group that now are going out and starting up their own research groups, developing the sorts of ideas and processes that we've done. So I think to feel like this has been pivotal in actually starting something that could, and I hope it will be, obviously, very big and could make a huge impact going forwards. I think that's tremendously rewarding.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you very much for that. And now we're going to shift over to think about public engagement with research. So to speak about that is our academic champion here in the MQLS division for public engagement with research, Professor David Pyle, who's a volcanologist, which is pretty cool, who's interested in understanding why volcanoes erupt. That sounds like a good question. But also for looking at new ways of finding out about past eruptions. So yeah, you're going to talk to us about public engagement research.
Yes. So as a volcanologist, it's a hugely privileged position to be in, because you get to travel around the world to amazing places, and inevitably that you see the wonders of nature in front of you. So as a geologist, I started out with my PhD looking at the past eruptions of Santorini volcano in Greece. So it's an amazing place. And as a geologist, what you do is you go out into the field and you map out and measure up the different layers, and then try and interpret what you see there in terms of the process. And after so having worked there for a while, started to piece together the eruption histories. I think the natural thing to do was then to go out and accept invitations to go and talk to schools, and take bits of rock along and so on. And that there's nothing more magical than taking a piece of obsidian and a piece of pumice into a class of 8-year-olds and seeing the excitement that generates. And so a lot of my sort of early public engagement activity was basically the inform and inspire variety, where you're going to small class settings. It's huge fun, hugely energetic for half an hour or an hour, and it's something that's really easy to do. And that's it makes you feel good, gives you a bit of a boost. But actually, that doesn't actually then really feed back into. It doesn't change the way that you do anything other than maybe engage with people. So after a few years, we got involved in a much larger scale project with some colleagues from the University of East Anglia and the British Geological Survey. And the project that we were going to look at was to try and work out, try and understand how people had responded to volcanic eruptions in the past. And so we ended up focusing, I ended up working in the Caribbean, and then we had other parts of the project in Ecuador and Colombia. And at the beginning of the project, it was very clear that actually we already had lots of experience of going out and talking to people. And so we set up part of the research process to involve workshops in communities around volcanoes. We didn't really know what was going to work. And so the first workshop we had was on the island of Montserrat. So Montserrat started erupting in 1995. It's the first volcanic eruption in recorded history on the island. And it bubbled along, and it reached a crisis point in late 1995, and then there were other crisis points in 96. A very devastating part of the eruption in 1997, and it's still not been declared finished. So we went to this workshop, and the workshop was open up. It was open to everyone on the island, and we I think we were there for 2 days. We laid out food. We didn't really have a structure. We just asked people to come along and tell us in any way they wanted their stories of the eruption. And of course, the island had originally had about 11,000 people living on the island, and then at the crunch point of the eruption, the population probably dropped below 4,000, and then it has slowly grown. So there are several different sorts of communities on the island now. People who've always lived on the island, people whose families have left and then perhaps slowly returned, or where parts of the family have returned. And then there are new people who've newly arrived. And that was it was a revelation, because as a physical scientist, we thought we knew, right, the track of the volcanic eruption, because we'd either been there, lots of us have been there, and we've been working on it, and we knew the key dates in terms of the way the volcano was behaving. But of course, actually, for the people living on the island, those weren't at all the dates that they associated with particular activities. So there were some phases of activity which everybody knew about. There were others that only the geologists cared about, and there were others, particularly I suppose it's fairly obvious, but the worst phase of the activity for most people who lived on the island were not the dramatic moments when the volcano was erupting, but they were the moments when every night or every afternoon or every morning they'd wake up or go outside, and there'd be another dusting of ash across everything, and have to go and clean up. And this is just kind of background activity. So it was. I mean, the thing is, these things are all really obvious. It was really obvious that actually, by talking to the people who lived through the crisis, it opened up a whole set of new questions and answers. So questions in terms of actually what are the important things that we need to understand about what the impacts are of the eruption, but also what can we then do about it if we, so it kind of changes your focus as a research scientist from thinking about the big parts of it to actually there's this whole kind of background phase of activity where it'd be really nice to know what's going on. So that was actually really interesting. And then at a slightly later phase of the project, we were doing some work on St. Vincent in the Caribbean. And St. Vincent, different from Montserrat, so it had a very damaging eruption in 1902, and then a couple of moderate eruptions in the 1970s. Again, we started off with a workshop, and this time it was we identified key members of the community, first responders, people involved in disaster reduction, policy, government, and so on. And again, it was fascinating that going to an island where there hadn't been a volcanic eruption in over 35 years, in a place where there'd just been a flood that had killed 4 people, was one of the most, a really damaging event in an environment where every summer season it's hurricane season. And actually the volcano and that volcanic hazard was surprisingly prominent in the understanding of the community, and they were actually really interested. And then when so I remember that meeting, I was talking about the 1902 eruption, and all I knew about it at that stage was what I'd gleaned from the official colonial reports. Now the official colonial reports are they're extraordinary because of course this was late Victorian era. And the agricultural superintendent went out and measured what actually happened, recorded what actually happened on each day that there was activity and where the volcanic debris ended up and so on. And actually these weren't stories that the Vincentian community were familiar with, but they all had their own stories passed down from their grandparents of the eruption. And actually we found that you could dovetail the two things together. So in the colonial records, it said, well, evacuations began on the 7th of May or something. And after that, the evacuees weren't really of interest to the official reporters. And so a few months later, there's some new buildings put in one location, and other people were in emergency accommodation for other periods of time. But actually, by talking to the people who's had the family connections to the people who've been involved, again, it suddenly develops a much richer understanding of the impacts of the eruption. So having started in those with those sorts of activities, we then thought about what activities can we develop that will allow us to share the stories of the eruption, both with communities who are interested on island or in communities near volcanoes, but also with other communities back in the UK or further afield who are also naturally interested in volcanoes. And so I think in 2014 we had an opportunity to run a public event at the Natural History Museum in London, and we built a replica volcano, and it was all modelled around the 1902 eruption, and that had a tremendously again. That worked really well as a kind of a public engagement space, because it was a physical object, and the stories that we told around that eruption was the stories of the volcano, but actually it was a very easy way of then engaging people with thinking about how would you respond if there was a volcanic eruption, and then that's spun off into subsequent projects where we've created, or my colleagues at UEA have created, a much smaller and portable kind of tent, again, a volcano-shaped tent, which has images and quotes and the stories of those earlier eruptions, and that's now a travelling exhibition on St. Vincent.
So it sounds like you've done, it's kind of naturally evolved and things like that, but kind of thinking back and again, thinking about who might be watching as an early career researcher, if you kind of had one tip for them, maybe they've done very little, what sorts of things would you suggest to people in terms of how to get started? Because I mean, for you, it sounds very organic, but I don't know, was there like a key thing that helped you along your way?
So I think it's organic in that you can, if you have if you work in a particular field site, then you can start small in a way. I mean, because you can always tell stories about, there's always some material objects you brought back with you, or images or sounds or something like that. So I think there's lots of ways that you can kind of, and I think, particularly talking to school groups in the UK, primary school children are just, they'll find anything fascinating if you give them an opportunity, because nobody has a sense, I don't think, of what's it actually like to do field work, for example. So I think you really can start small, and I think you shouldn't feel obliged to do things that you're not invested in yourself. And I think that's for me, that I've never done popular science. It's all about. So
it's all within your field.
It's all within my field, within my comfort zone, really. but I think and other people like to do things completely differently, and that's totally fine. But in terms of developing a way of being able to balance your time and commitments between the research and the engagement with the research, for me, that's the most natural thing, is to have the engagement elements directly spinning out of the things that I'm interested in.
Great. I think that covers lots of points. So different audiences, different types of engagement, find what's comfortable for you. There's lots of great things in there. So thank you very much. So next we're going to move on to Tom, last but definitely not least, Dr. Tom Hart, who is an independent research fellow in the Department of Zoology, again here at the university. Tom's a penguinologist, which is super cool. And he is the PI of a really popular citizen science project called Penguin Watch. However, you might talk a little bit about that, but mainly what Tom's going to be talking about is policy. So hand it over to Tom.
Yeah, thanks. It's actually quite fun going last, because I get to pick up on the kind of the non-standard career path. And also, I think for policy, I do a lot of engagement, but also for policy, the idea of what is retrospectively obvious when you ask the question. And also, but at the same time, staying in your comfort zone or your area of expertise. So yeah, as Michaela said, I run Penguin Watch with the Zooniverse, which is now one of the very biggest citizen science projects in the world. And what that does is we leave time-lapse cameras all around Antarctica, and they record the daily lives of penguins, and by time-lapse we can build up a picture of when things first turn up, penguin breeding success and things like that. And we do it by engaging with vast numbers of citizen scientists. And partly as a spin out of that, and partly because this is doing something on a much bigger scale, which means we should be able to answer questions that people haven't been able to before. And the whole point, or one of the big points, is conservation. So the so what. In a lot of biology, there are very definite policy outcomes because you are trying to do this for a reason, in that you think a population is threatened. So I've been quite lucky in that there are fundamental ecological questions that I do out of interest, and there's a lot of drive because a lot of these populations are threatened, and we want to understand that in a way we can do something about it. So it's funny to talk about policy engagement, because I both do a lot of it, and I think I do a lot of it badly. So maybe that makes me a good person to talk about it. But when you're up and coming and starting, you want to engage with this. I think it's quite hard. But there's a couple of tips, like just go to a lot of these events where there are ministers speaking, or you can, to some degree, piggyback on other people's events and outreach. That could be an NGO, it could be a town hall meeting or something like that. And that's a bit of a soft entry in. You can see what you agree with, you can see what point they're missing and whether you can feed into that. And actually, to some degree, building up contacts matter, because policymakers are several different people. They might be vested interest groups, they might be government ministers, they might be stakeholders, the public and smaller stakeholders on a big scale. And I think for all of that, you need credibility, and you probably need to build that over time. And that's where individual connections matter. I mean, you could go and lobby your MP. You can find their interests online. It doesn't have to be your MP. It could be someone that has an interest. You think you align with that. You know that they are going to some degree be receptive. So that might be the weak link, getting in front of someone. But it's important to note, and this is where I do it badly. It's important to note that you could have the answer and they might never be interested. Policy, to a large degree, happens from the centre outward. So you need to listen out for when they might be receptive to it so that you can actually engage. Until then, it might be a lot harder work to actually engage with them to get it as a priority on their agenda. But you can do that. It's just work, and it's softly and it builds up. I've been really lucky in that places like South Georgia government, these are very small groups. So the people, you can go and talk to them. And actually, the successes I've been involved with are where they are already receptive to finding a problem, and they just want to engage with a lot of different people to get consensus and evidence. So in one sense, that is when policy happens really effectively. In others, you might be bashing your head against a brick wall. Public engagement helps with that, though. One of the best bits of advice I've been given is that where there are contentious topics, do not use that language. If it's climate change, don't talk about climate change, because you are embedding people. People have taken sides. So you are automatically turning someone who is on your side, embedding them, agreeing with you, and you've already alienated someone against that concept. So if you don't use that language, you get both sides to think. And so not using those key words can be far more informative to getting everyone to come together and think and actually discuss stuff than.
What sort of alternative have you found does work?
Weather trends. I mean, I'm lucky. I don't really have to talk about climate change. I mean, we do with penguins, but that might not be the key thing. A current one, and I think this is future-proof, is to talk about Brexit. In that Brexit is a word that will have people dug in for or against. But if you start talking about a relationship with Europe, or relationships between local government, central government, and Europe, that probably is going to get everyone far further along a dialogue than just saying, so today's topic, Brexit, any opinion?
Dangerous.
So that was really good advice. Also, I think starting small and building up. I think your point of staying within your comfort zone, which also means your integrity. You could very much align yourself with any kind of NGO, and you could be part of making something happen, but nuance might matter, and the details might actually be important to avoiding a perverse result. And then the next thing, following on from your question, so some things that were asked were, how much of this should you do, or how much is this taken seriously in your career, I think this comes with some penalties for your career. I really do, at least when you're starting out. As a junior research fellow coming up, I think this is a distraction where, to some degree, getting grants and getting employment is purely dependent on money and publication rate. And at the university level, this is starting to change with things like engagement awards. But ultimately, your currency as a researcher is, do you have grants and do you have good publications? So yeah, I think this comes with a penalty, but over time, that impact matters for your credibility for your career to some degree. We've had some luck by showing impact on getting certainly foundations and money over time. But yeah, I think this is something you need to very carefully weigh up between when do you put your head above the parapet as to when you have enough evidence to shout about and change policy, and also without it distracting from your day-to-day job, which is a hard choice. Sorry.
What's helped you kind of find the balance and overall, like, obviously you're driven to do this. I don't know what the sort of.
Well, I'm really lucky in the sense that if you're trying to protect wildlife, you have to.
Yeah.
So without this, you wonder what the point of doing the research or doing the project is. So in one sense, that's very easy. But it is a tricky balance in research versus making a difference. I think that will be very different for different fields and for different people. But yeah, it's harder starting out. As you get older, I think it's more expected. And that's how they measure esteem in your later career. It's not so much evaluated or a positive thing in your junior career.
So you feel, I don't know if you all agree that there is like a long game to be played, but so obviously it's really important to find the right balance. But yeah, I guess that's our time is kind of run out a bit there, but yeah, I said I would point to some further resources. So before we go, obviously, if you want to explore engagement further, then there's some really good resources from the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement on publicengagement.ac.uk. So that's everything about why do this, how do you find that balance, why do it, how to do it, how to plan it, how to evaluate it, which might be really important for those thinking about impact case studies for the ref and so on. That's a really great one. Obviously, shout out for our own resources here at the university. If you go to ox.ac.uk/public-engagement, you'll find those animations about what public engagement is and lots of other tools and resources. For enterprise and entrepreneurship, there's eship.ox.ac.uk. That's got loads of case studies, lots of Oxford-based stuff, but loads of case studies and other things that might be helpful. And policy engagement is developing here at Oxford, but there are loads of stuff again on NCCP's and other websites. Any other things, websites or anything that you guys would suggest as being really helpful? Or is that covering it? That covers it. Great. Well, I just want to thank you all for watching, but most importantly for thanking David, Tom and Angie for joining us this afternoon. I hope you found it useful to think about what you'd like to do and where you might go. I'm sure, because I think they're all on Twitter, if you want to ask them some questions, I'll just volunteer them. Throw some questions our way. I'm sure we can help answer them. But yeah, thank you very much and bye from us. Bye.
Thank you.